Okay, folks, hello. Welcome to another week of offsite learning, our second last week. Okay, so we're continuing through biology. I've posted the new notes for this week in the Google Classroom agenda. You'll notice it starts out on page 14. That's just because it picks up right where we left off last week. I'm just kind of posting the whole biology units notes week by week this time instead of all at once. No reason really. Okay, so we'll get started. Page 14. So the big ideas for topic 1 today, okay, how does the total amount of matter on Earth change over time? What are the basics of the water cycle? So you should be able to explain it in general terms if a Science 10 student were to ask you. What are the basics of the carbon cycle? Same thing. Some more specific questions with the carbon cycle. What's a carbon sink? What is organic versus inorganic carbon? How are photosynthesis and cellular respiration involved in the carbon cycle? What do they have to do with all this? What are the basics of the oxygen cycle? Which other cycle is it very, very, very closely related with, so much so that we actually often just group them, and how are photosynthesis and cellular respiration involved here in the oxygen cycle? Okay, so as you can probably guess, we are beginning to look today at some types of matter cycles in ecosystems, okay, or on Earth in general. So what is matter? Well, you are matter, right? Anything you can kind of reach out and touch and feel and knock on is matter, okay, including, well, even gas, air is matter, right? That might leave you asking, what is not matter? Well, energy, right? So heat, sound, light, those things are not matter. So essentially, everything in the universe can be sorted into matter or energy. Okay, we've been looking at energy flow through ecosystems. Now we're going to take a look at how matter moves in ecosystems. So the amount of matter on Earth is constant. Constant just means it doesn't change. We are stuck with what we've got. So why don't we run out? Why have we not drinking all the water yet? We know from geology, we've been here for a few billion years now, right? How come living things have not drank up all the water? Well, it's being recycled, okay? All matter is eventually broken down to the atomic level and reused in an ecosystem. Otherwise, we would have ran out of water millions of years ago. All living and non-living things are made up of atoms and molecules that have been recycled over and over and over again. As when it comes to matter, like I said, Earth is basically stuck with what it's got. So the air that you are breathing right now, there's a good chance that the same air molecules were breathed in by William Shakespeare, okay, or by a dinosaur, right? The water you took a shower with this morning was at some point at least a few molecules. There's actually almost a 100% chance that the shower you took today contained a few molecules that at one time were dinosaur pee. So how does the movement of matter within ecosystems compare to the movement of energy through ecosystems? Well, we just finished talking about how energy moves through ecosystems. What did we say? Was energy recycled? Once the energy moved through the food chain, did it go back to the beginning? No, right? It was lost. It was gone forever. If the sun is not there constantly providing more energy, we're out of luck, right? All food chains collapse. We need the sun constantly there providing more. So energy flows in one direction, one arrow, but matter gets reused over and over and over again. The cycle. Okay, so there are a few ways that matter is recycled, and we call them biogeochemical cycles. What a great name. Tells you everything you need to know. Bio, what does that mean? Life. Geo, we know that one. Earth. Chemical, well, that one's pretty straightforward. Chemicals, right? It has to do with chemistry. So biogeochemical cycles are the way that matter is recycled through living and non-living parts of the earth. So some of the water in the ocean is going to someday end up as part of a human being, and then it will be back to the ocean through living and non-living parts. So the first one we're going to look at is the hydrological cycle. We're going to look at 2 today, 1 tomorrow. Okay, hydrological, again, if you're dehydrated, what do you need? You need water. Hydro means water. Okay, usually you just hear it as the water cycle, but the fancy name is the hydrological cycle. And it happens through 5 main processes that you have probably learned in previous science classes. It's a cycle, so there's really no such thing as the first thing that happens, but we have to start somewhere. So let's start with evaporation. You've noticed I've kind of put 1A and 1B. That's because essentially these are the same processes. It's just that in one, the water is in a lake or an ocean, in the other, it's in a plant. Okay. So what is evaporation? Well, it's water absorbs solar energy and becomes water vapor. Then it rises up in the atmosphere because it's hot, it's water vapor, right? Transpiration is basically evaporation, but it's through the leaves of plants. Okay, you learned about it a bit in Science 10. During cellular respiration, plants open up and release water. Okay, so you have here transpiration. As you know, as you heat up water, what can you make it do? If you heat up water enough, you make it boil, right? And when it boils, eventually it all becomes vapor. If you leave it long enough, you'll have no liquid water left. It will all be steam out in the room. So that is happening from the sun's energy. It is evaporating, okay? And it is also being transpirated through the leaves of trees. That one is not caused by the sun's energy, but the end result is the same, okay? Okay, then what? Once it's evaporated, well, it goes up and up and up in the atmosphere. And as you know, if you've ever looked at the tops of mountains, even in the summertime, there can be snow and ice, right? That's because as you go up in the atmosphere, it gets colder. What happens to water when it's colder? Well, it doesn't get cold enough to freeze it or anything. I mean, it can, but it definitely makes it cool enough to not be steam anymore, to not be water vapor. So it condenses into a liquid again and forms into droplets. And that's what a cloud is. It's a bunch of water droplets that have evaporated and now condensed. Okay, precipitation. Well, as more and more of these water molecules evaporate and go up to the cloud and condense and join together, right? Water kind of sticks together. Eventually, it gets too heavy to stay up there in the atmosphere and it will fall back down to the earth as, you guessed it, rain or snow if it's cold enough, or hail or sleet, whatever it might be, right? But some form of precipitation. So that is water that is now joined up, is now too heavy and can no longer stay as a kind of a liquid suspended in a cloud, and so it falls down as a heavy droplet of rain. Then we have what's called runoff, which is kind of exactly what it sounds like, right? So condensation, okay? These clouds can actually travel incredibly far. So water that evaporated in China might end up raining in Alberta tomorrow, right? Clouds can move very far in a very short amount of time. Okay, so then it precipitates. And then what happens to rain and water? Well, next time it's a rainy day, go outside and look, right? You see water rushing down to storm drains and things like that. So that happens in nature too, right? There's kind of paths that water finds, it erodes the surface as it goes. It also takes a lot of stuff with it as it goes. Some of it might be good, some of it might be bad, depends where the rain fell. We'll talk about that in the next topic. So water from either melting ice or precipitation makes its way over land to bodies of liquid water. So to rivers, a lot of rivers feed lakes, but then those lakes have another river that goes to feed the ocean. So I just want to give you a bit of a heads up as we go through all of the matter cycles. I want you to be looking at ways that the water cycle, and all of them really, but especially the water cycle, because water is so important and so connected to all life, okay? Notice how it pops up and is a part of the other cycles as well. So the matter cycles are all what we call interconnected, right? You can't really separate them. They affect each other. They play a role in each other's processes. Okay, so as we move on to the remaining matter cycles, because we're already finished with the water cycle, I want you to look for the processes in which the water cycle has an important role. Every time that happens, say, hey, that's the water cycle popping up. So just a quick animation of the water cycle, kind of in summary, right? So that was evaporation. Now it's condensed into a cloud. The clouds got too heavy, and so the water droplets got too heavy, and so now precipitation is falling, and sun heats it up again. It's not really showing the runoff, but again, notice it's a cycle. It ends up right back where it started. It has to, otherwise the cycle would eventually end, right? Which, lucky for us, it has not done yet, anyway. Okay, the next of the matter cycles that we're going to look at is the carbon cycle. So the carbon cycle, when you really boil it down to its simplest level, is basically just the movement of carbon between two main forms, and that's organic and inorganic. Hey, where do we hear organic carbon before? Yeah, we heard it in our chemistry unit, right? What made organic carbon organic? Well, that they are the building blocks of life, right? Carbon that is contained in living things is called organic carbon, okay? So all life on Earth is composed of organic matter, molecules containing carbon and hydrogen, hydrocarbons, right, as we saw before. And these are the building blocks for proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. They're the building blocks of life. Without carbon, you do not exist, okay? Inorganic carbon, you can probably guess, is carbon that is contained in non-living things. And there's a lot of that around too, right? When I say carbon, what probably pops into your head? Well, maybe carbon dioxide, right? That's what kind of pops into my head. So there are basically four main places where inorganic carbon is found, and they are known as carbon sinks. What's a carbon sink? It's something that basically stores carbon for us. It absorbs more carbon than it emits. So it kind of hangs on to carbon for us. It does eventually introduce it back into some other form, but it absorbs more carbon than it emits. Okay, so the four main places, the atmosphere, right? A lot of CO2 in the atmosphere. Actually, it's not a ton, but it's definitely going up, right? So that is a big reservoir for carbon. Oceans, okay, oceans contain a lot of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide actually has a very high solubility in the oceans. Since we've seen a big increase in atmospheric carbon, a lot of that has been taken on by the ocean. That has been having some effects on coral reefs and things like that, okay? A lot of carbon is found in sedimentary rocks. What's a sedimentary rock? Well, it's just layers of sediments. Remember, sediments are things like sand, mud, silt, fine little clay that hardens, builds up into layers over time, okay? Something that is more commonly called limestone, okay, but the chemical name is calcium carbonate. That carbon, see that there? Every time you see a C here, right, that's carbon. C, okay. It's formed when atmospheric carbon, so the carbon CO2 that's floating around right now that you're breathing out of your lungs, when it combines with precipitation. Hey, remember what I said about looking for connections to the water cycle? Hint, hint, there's one, okay, which then erodes rocks that contain calcium ions. So that carbonic acid is called, okay, erodes rocks which contain calcium ions. The calcium then combine with bicarbonate in the oceans and form CaCO3. Long way of saying basically a lot of carbon is hanging out in rocks, in limestone. And then another big reservoir of inorganic carbon, carbon that is not in living things, is in things that used to be living, okay? Fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are formed when dead organic material is trapped between layers of rock. So for example, most of Fort McMurray's oil sands come from some cyanobacteria that were kind of trapped between layers of rock, compressed, until all their organic parts became hydrocarbons that we would consider inorganic now. Okay, carbon not in a living thing, obviously. So how does this cycling really occur? How does carbon go from being in a living thing to a non-living thing, or vice versa? Well, remember that producers convert atmospheric CO2 into glucose, energy-rich glucose, basically sugar, right? Through the process of photosynthesis. Who else can do photosynthesis besides producers? Trick question. Only producers can do photosynthesis, right? But like we said, you're a living thing and you need carbon. It makes up your proteins, your fats, and your carbohydrates, right? And obviously, glucose, the thing you use for cellular respiration, the thing you use for all of your life functions, contains carbon, C, right? So how do you get the carbon you need? Because you can't make your own glucose. So where do we get it from? From producers, right? We have to eat a producer, or we have to eat a consumer that ate a producer, or eat a consumer that ate a consumer that ate a producer, and on and on and on. You get it, right? But either way, at some point, there must be a producer that did this photosynthesis. So consumers and decomposers, don't forget decomposers, obtain the carbon they need by either consuming, if it's a consumer, or breaking down, if it's a decomposer, other organisms, right? So we get our carbon by having a salad or having a piece of fish, right? Decomposers get it by breaking down a dying plant or a dying fish. Different process, same end result. We get the carbon we need for life processes, like cellular respiration, okay? So cellular respiration is basically photosynthesis backwards. So when you breathe in, do you know what you're breathing in, or at least what you're going to use in the stuff you breathe in? You're going to breathe in, well, lots of stuff, but your lungs are going to use the oxygen, right? And then they're going to do an exchange and they're going to breathe out CO2, carbon dioxide, okay? That's because you're breathing in oxygen to be used in your cellular respiration. And then since cellular respiration has already been happening, obviously, because you're alive, and if cellular respiration ever stops, you are no longer alive, right? So you will breathe out that CO2 that has been produced from other cellular respiration reactions. So as we are breathing in and out and in and out and in and out, we, and as all consumers and producers, because every living thing does cellular respiration, we release CO2 back into the atmosphere, right? Through the process of cellular respiration, which converts glucose into energy that can be used to carry out cellular functions. So yes, we do this, but also every other consumer does this, and even producers do this, okay? Every living thing does cellular respiration, okay? Now I want you to think about this in terms of the carbon cycle. So notice here, in photosynthesis, is CO2 getting used up or is it getting produced? Yeah, we just said it's going to get used up, right? To make glucose that we can use for energy. Whereas in cellular respiration, what's happening to CO2? Is it getting used up or is it getting produced and released? Well, this stuff got used up to make, oh, there it is, CO2. It's being produced. So the only things that can lower carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are producers. Everything else can only increase it, right? We are only capable of increasing the CO2. Only producers can do photosynthesis. So only they can lower the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. You'll notice that here when you look at this kind of picture summary of the carbon cycle, right? Look at all the arrows going into the atmosphere. How many arrows are going out of the atmosphere? Only one, and it goes in by photosynthesis. Okay, so again, where do you get the carbon you need to live? Well, you get it by maybe eating this cow that ate the tree, right? Or if you're really into trees, maybe you just ate the tree yourself. Okay, a big one, the one that is kind of throwing this matter cycle completely out of balance, is the use of fossil fuels, right? Remember, combustion just means some hydrocarbon, which comes from a fossil fuel. Notice fossil fuels come up here, right? Makes water and carbon dioxide. You might notice that looks a lot like cellular respiration. Yeah, cellular respiration is actually pretty much just a form of combustion. It's just one that happens inside the cells of our bodies. But still, right, you see the shape of this. It's a cycle. So all of these things, plants doing cellular respiration, animals doing cellular respiration, us doing fossil fuel combustion, contribute more CO2 to the atmosphere. Only one process actually removes CO2 from the atmosphere, and that's photosynthesis. So not only have we gone way past what producers can handle in terms of converting the carbon back, right? We've kind of created a backup, a backlog of CO2 that needs to be dealt with. We've actually made the problem even worse because we do a lot of deforestation and clear cutting. And so not only are we putting more carbon out there in the atmosphere, we're taking away a whole bunch of the one thing that can actually pull it out and restore balance to the cycle. So I really like this graphic. It kind of sums up every single process in the carbon cycle. It looks like a lot at first, but just kind of pick one thing and follow it along, and you'll see it kind of does a nice job of mapping out the carbon cycle. So carbon dioxide could be here in the atmosphere in the ocean, right? And it could move into a producer by photosynthesis. Again, I want you to notice arrow directions, right? Which one, how many arrows are taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere? Only one, photosynthesis, right? Consumers only do respiration. They don't do photosynthesis. So they put carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Decomposers only do respiration. They put carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Combustion of fossil fuels obviously puts CO2 in the atmosphere. Weathering of carboniferous rocks, those are the ones we were talking about earlier, calcium carbonate. When they get eroded, they actually release the carbon in them into the atmosphere, okay? Then we have over here another big store of it, dead stuff, basically. That's detritus or detritus, okay? When produced, everything dies. So producers die, consumers die. They become dead stuff. That's dead carbon, okay? Now, that dead stuff could get eaten or decayed by a decomposer, right? And now the decomposer can use that carbon for its life function, okay? It could also get fossilized, which if it gets fossilized in the right way, it becomes a fossil fuel, which can then be combusted, bringing us back to the atmosphere. Right? Now, these carboniferous rocks, one thing I kind of left out, calcium carbonate is often the stuff that shells and bones are made out of in aquatic animals. So a lot of limestone is actually the shells of a whole bunch of old sea organisms. Okay, so that dead stuff gets sedimented and it actually becomes a rock. And then if the rock gets weathered, boom, back in the atmosphere. So notice it's a cycle, but the cycle really leans heavily this way, and only one arrow goes back this way. It's a delicate cycle. It's actually a very slow cycle as well. So they say that even if we stopped all fossil fuel combustion tomorrow, which obviously will not happen, but even if we did, the amount of carbon in our atmosphere would actually increase, not even stop, or let alone decrease. The amount of carbon in our atmosphere would actually continue to increase for about 50 to 100 years. That's how much we've kind of thrown things out of whack. Okay, so just a bit of practice here. Identify which type of organism assembles complex organic compounds from elements and simple compounds. Name and describe the process that allows them to do this. Okay, so we're taking complex organic compounds and we're building them out of elements and simple compounds. So elements are, so basically complex organic compounds, that means lots of atoms, lots of numbers and letters, whereas elements and simple compounds means a couple letters, one or two of them, right? So what process does this sound like? Well, when I see this, I think of photosynthesis because we have elements and simple compounds, right? H2O plus CO2, making a complex organic compound, glucose, okay? It also makes oxygen, which is an element, but still it makes that glucose, okay? So what can do this? This is photosynthesis, right? And who can do photosynthesis? Only one type of organism, producers. Identify which type of organism feeds on other living organisms as its source of essential elements and compounds. So who has to eat other stuff to get its essential nutrients and compounds? Right, things that consume each other, right? Consumers. Identify which type of organisms feed on dead and decaying matter as their source of essential elements and compounds. So what gets its elements that it needs to live from dead and dying stuff? Well, the things that break it down so that it can be recycled. Okay, consider your answer to number 3. These organisms will take the dead and decaying organic matter and convert it into elements and simple compounds. What is the name of this process, and what type of organism will use the elements and simple compounds that it results in? So what's the name of that process? Well, decomposers breaking down dead stuff into elements and simple compounds, that's called decomposition. That's where the name decomposer comes from, okay? Which type of organism will use the elements and their compounds that it results in? So what benefits from decomposers breaking down stuff into simple nutrients in the soil? Who's going to use those nutrients in the soil? Plants, right? With their roots, they're going to absorb them. Producers, okay? They will absorb those nutrients. That's why worms and mushrooms and stuff like that are very healthy for a garden. They break dead stuff down into essentially fertilizer, right? Natural fertilizer. Okay, consider your answers to number 1, 2, 3. All of these organisms will take complex organic compounds and convert them to simple compounds. Identify and describe the process that allows that to happen. So since it's saying everybody does it, I have a feeling what it is, but let's just check. So what do producers, consumers, and decomposers all do? Which process do they do that takes complex organic compounds, like glucose, and converts them to simple compounds, like carbon dioxide and water? Okay, cellular respiration. Everything does it. It's photosynthesis backwards. So you take the sugar in your cells, the food energy you have, you take a nice breath of oxygen, and that allows you to have the energy you need for the day, right? When you're finished, you exhale out some CO2, and you actually exhale out some water vapor as well. So again, why this? Because in order for you to do anything, this reaction needs to be happening inside your cells. Glucose needs to be recombining with oxygen that you're giving it through your lungs to produce ATP, which is just the molecule that kind of provides us with energy. Okay? Carbon dioxide, which you're then going to breathe out, and water. Cellular respiration. Okay, now it asks us to put it all together. So using our answers to number 1 to 5, describe the organic portion of the carbon cycle using those things that we talked about. So in number 1, we talked about producers making glucose and oxygen using photosynthesis, and they took carbon dioxide to do that. Right? Okay, so producers remove CO2, they convert it to glucose. Now that glucose is in a living thing. How does it keep moving through this cycle? Well, it could stay in that producer forever, which would eventually die and get decomposed, but let's do a little bit more of an interesting cycle. Let's say consumers can obtain glucose they need by eating producers. Reminder, why is glucose part of the carbon cycle? Well, look at that, a C, right? Okay. Now, eventually, consumers and producers are all going to die, and when they die, what happens to them? They get decomposed. And when they're decomposed, what do the decomposers get out of that? Well, yeah, they get their glucose. They get their carbon that they need for their functions, okay? Decomposers also break down some of the organic matter into simple nutrients that can be absorbed by plant roots, right? A plant cannot just absorb a dead moose's nutrients. It has to be broken down into simpler compounds first. And there's only one kind of organism for that job, decomposers. Okay, so we're back to producers, but we're not back to carbon in the atmosphere. Do you see why? We've kind of left something out this whole time, and I left it out because no one organism does it. They all do it. So along this whole time, all of them are releasing CO2 through what process? Cellular respiration, right? That's why they made the glucose. That's why you need the glucose. That's why you ate your breakfast, is so that you had the fuel you needed to do cellular respiration, which allows you to breathe, walk, speak, talk, have your heart beat, not freeze to death, all that stuff. All costs energy, and the energy comes from chemical energy and glucose. So again, just another pretty simple representation of the carbon cycle, right? You see most things, all the arrows, most of them are putting them out into the atmosphere. One arrow comes out of the atmosphere, and that is photosynthesis through the flower, right? You see some dead stuff. This dead rabbit is being decomposed, turned into potentially fossil fuels at the very least, into carbon that can be reabsorbed by other producers through their roots, but that's the general idea. Okay, this one is so closely related to the carbon cycle that we often don't even distinguish between them. We kind of think of them as one cycle, okay? But they're very closely related due to the connections between cellular respiration and photosynthesis, right? So remember, during photosynthesis, producers remove CO2 and they release O2. But during cellular respiration, everything, it's not just producers, but everything removes O2 and releases CO2. So in photosynthesis, you lower CO2 levels and you raise O2 levels, oxygen levels. In cellular respiration, you do the exact opposite. You take oxygen out of the atmosphere and you put more carbon dioxide in. So, who can raise oxygen levels in the atmosphere? What type of organisms? Can you or I do it? Nope. You and me can only ever lower the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere, right? When we breathe in, we are constantly removing oxygen and breathing out CO2. Okay? So, a very simple diagram, but it's essentially what you need to know, right? Plants create oxygen with photosynthesis. It looks like it's going through the sun. It doesn't need to go through the sun. The sun is just there for to show that it's required for photosynthesis, but it's not like the sun makes the oxygen go in the cow. The cow makes the oxygen go in the cow by breathing it, right? And then they breathe out CO2, which, as we know, is needed for photosynthesis. It's a reactant in photosynthesis, so that CO2 will be used in photosynthesis, and then later, once it's converted to oxygen, it'll be spit out again. So what's happening in here? CO2 is going in here, make glucose and oxygen, which that oxygen is now going to go released through the leaves of the trees. So here's a graph of the oxygen concentration in our atmosphere as a function of the time of day. So you just see it's pretty basic graph, but it just has dawn, dusk, and dawn. So it asks us, why would the above graph look like this? What's different about each time of day? So let's start there. What's different about dawn, dusk, and dawn? Well, dawn just means morning, right? In the morning, what's happening? Well, the sun is just coming up, right? And so the sun has not been up all night. What else is needed for photosynthesis? Yes, CO2, yes, H2O, but the most important, maybe of all, is sunlight, right? So no sunlight, no photosynthesis. Okay, now if there's no photosynthesis, remember, what does photosynthesis do? It takes carbon dioxide and it makes more oxygen, right? So no sunlight, no photosynthesis, no oxygen being released, right? But then the sun comes out. The sun comes out at about dawn, right? And so what do plants start doing? They start doing photosynthesis. And if they're doing photosynthesis, what are they making? They're making oxygen, right? So notice the sun comes out here and photosynthesis starts. So oxygen is being produced. Then at nighttime, dusk, so the sun sets. And so what stops happening? Photosynthesis, right? So photosynthesis stops, but just photosynthesis stopping on its own wouldn't make oxygen go down, right? It would just make it stop. It wouldn't make it go down. So why does it go down? Well, think about it. What are all living things doing? Even when plants aren't doing photosynthesis, they're doing, and you and me are definitely doing it even at nighttime. We're doing cellular respiration. And what does cellular respiration use up? Oxygen. O2 is being used up by cellular respiration, which it always is. It's just that now there's nothing replenishing it. And then this repeats, right? So it's almost like every day the earth kind of breathes in and breathes out, increases its oxygen, and then it drops at night when the plants stop doing photosynthesis because there's no sun. And then it increases it and then it drops it. Directly on the graph, add and label a line that would show what CO2 concentration might look like through the same amount of time. Okay, so now we have to think. So cellular respiration is going to have an effect, but cellular respiration is happening all the time, no matter what. So it's not like it depends on the day, on the time of day, right? So what does photosynthesis do to carbon dioxide? Well, it uses it up, right? So at dawn, before the sun comes out, that carbon dioxide has just kind of been building up overnight as all of us cellular respirators have been doing it all night, making more and more CO2 with no producers doing photosynthesis to remove it, right? So it starts out pretty high. But when the sun rises, they start using it up. And so it goes down and down and down and down. But then the sun sets and photosynthesis stops, right? And so what happens? Just cellular respiration. Cellular respiration has been happening this whole time, but now it's just cellular respiration with no photosynthesis to counteract it. So CO2, the sun sets, photosynthesis stops. Okay, so I'll pull up the big ideas for topic one. Hopefully you're able to pull these out. If not, maybe go back and look at the notes or rewind through the video lesson. How does the total amount of matter on Earth change over time? What are the basics of the water cycle? So just outline in general steps what's kind of going on. What are the basics of the carbon cycle? What's a carbon sink? What's organic and inorganic carbon? How are photosynthesis and cellular respiration involved in the carbon cycle? What are the basics of the oxygen cycle? Which other cycle is it very, very closely related with? So much so that we sometimes don't even split them up. And how are photosynthesis and cellular respiration involved here in the oxygen cycle? All right, that wraps up topic one. If you're looking for practice with this stuff, try the topic one practice portion of the practice assignment for this week.